The dress had taken 3 weeks to finish. Maisie knew this because she had counted every one of the 21 days while old Hesse hunched over the sewing table, needle and thread working by the light of low candles, wrinkled fingers guiding ivory fabric with the kind of patience that only comes from someone who has seen too much of this world. It was the only wedding gift the old seamstress could give. And Maisie had held that dress in her lap, like something sacred, the morning Hesse delivered it, folded over brown paper, no ribbon, no bow, just a pinch on the cheek, and a look that said, "You deserve this, girl." She was 23 years old. She had never owned a dress made for her body. Maisie had stood in front of the cracked mirror in Hesse's back room for a long time that morning, turning slowly, watching the ivory fabric move with her like it had been waiting to exist in exactly this shape. The neckline was modest, the sleeves tapered at the wrist, and along the hem, Hesse had embroidered a thin border of wild bramble in pale silver thread. Small, precise, almost invisible unless the light caught it at the right angle. It was the most beautiful thing Maisie had ever worn. She had pressed her fingers against the embroidery and told herself that tonight would be worth every quiet year of waiting. Her friend Kala had fixed her hair in the early afternoon, braiding sections back from her face and pinning them with 2 small bone clips that had belonged to Maisie's mother. Kala had fussed and tutted and told her she looked like someone the old stories would be written about, and Maisie had laughed and told her to stop before she believed it. But she had believed it, just a little, just enough to walk into that hall with her chin level. The great hall of Clan Hartwell was full when she arrived. Torches along the stone walls threw orange light across the blue and silver banners of the pack, and the smell of burning resin mingled with red wine and cured leather. Long oak tables seated dozens of wolves from several clans, all summoned to witness the choosing ceremony, the moment when Colin Hartwell, firstborn son of Alpha Reginald Hartwell, would announce his mate before everyone. Maisie walked the side corridor with her shoulders back and her chin level. She knew the glances sliding over her carried the bored familiarity of people looking at old furniture. She was known here, the daughter of no one, raised at the edge of Hartwell territory. No registered bloodline, no name that carried weight. The woman Colin had courted in secret for 2 full years, making promises on moonlit nights where no one could hear. "I'll choose you in front of everyone," he had said 3 weeks ago, fingers tangled in her hair, voice rough with something she had believed was love. "It doesn't matter what my father says. I'm the one who chooses." She had believed him. The ivory dress moved softly against the stone floor. Colin stood on the raised platform at the far end of the hall, flanked by his father and the clan elders. He wore the blue ceremonial mantle, dark hair combed back, jaw set. He was handsome in the way that alpha sons tend to be, built to look powerful, even when they aren't. His eyes found Maisie's when she reached the middle of the hall, and for 1 second, just one, she saw something in his face that she recognized as fear. It was not the love she had expected to find there. Alpha Reginald raised his hand, and the murmur of the hall died down to complete silence. Maisie stopped where she stood, a few steps from the central aisle, surrounded by strangers who didn't know her name, but would soon know her face. "This ceremony marks the choice of my son and heir," Reginald said, his voice filling the stone room without effort. "A choice that will strengthen our clan and seal our alliance with Clan Voss." Maisie heard the word alliance, and something cold began sliding down her spine, slowly, like water down the back of the neck on a winter morning. Colin stepped forward. He did not look at her. "I choose Petra Voss," he said, "as my mate and future Luna of Clan Hartwell." The hall answered with a murmur that grew too fast. Maisie stood still. The cold in her spine had reached her stomach. She heard the name Petra Voss echo between the stone columns, as though the hall itself wanted it carved in place. And then she saw the woman emerge from the right side of the platform, tall, black hair to the waist, a burgundy mantle. The smile of someone who had known longer than Maisie that this was going to happen. Someone near Maisie said something in a low voice. She couldn't make out the words, but she recognized the tone. It was the tone people use when commenting on something entirely predictable. She really thought he was going to choose her. Heat climbed Maisie's neck at a speed that shamed her. She did not beg. She did not shout. She did not let her knees buckle, though they wanted to. She breathed through her nose, resin, wine, the sharp smell of her own humiliation, and looked once, only once, at Colin Hartwell. He finally looked back. There was something in his face that wanted to be regret, but arrived too late and too small to have a real name. Maisie turned her back on him. The ivory dress did not deserve to stand still in that place. She began walking toward the exit, slowly. Because running would be worse. Each step measured as though the floor might give way at any moment, and she needed to be ready not to fall. The side corridor was darker, less crowded. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears and tried not to listen to it. She passed a table where 2 older women from Clan Hartwell sat close together. And though they lowered their voices when they saw her, they did not lower them fast enough. Poor girl. She never had a chance. Reginald would never allow it. Maisie kept walking. She thought about the bramble embroidery along her hem. She thought about Hessa's fingers, patient over 21 days. She thought about Calla pinning her hair that afternoon and saying, "You look like someone the old stories would be written about," and she pressed her teeth together and decided that she would not cry until she was outside, in the dark, where the pine trees wouldn't care. The great doors of the hall stood open to the night. The smell from outside reached her before the sight did. Wet earth, pine, high-altitude air. Maisie was 3 steps from the threshold when a presence blocked the light. It was not 1 man who entered, it was 3. She stopped. The first was broad across the shoulders and moved as though the floor belonged to him by birthright, short auburn hair, a grin at the corner of his mouth that didn't look like warmth. It looked like the kind of amusement that needs a good story to exist. The second was leaner, darker, a silver ring on his index finger and a way of tilting his head that suggested he had already calculated everything before stepping inside. The third entered last and needed none of those gestures. He simply stood there, and the space around him changed, tall. A black mantle without ornament, dark hair, eyes that caught the torchlight and gave nothing back. No particular expression on his face. Not curiosity, not judgment, not the kind of attention men usually carry when looking at a woman in distress. Only observation. Complete, quiet, and absolutely fixed on her. Maisie recognized the crests embroidered on the capes of the first 2. Clan Draveth, Clan Morvain. Names that appear in stories the way thunder appears before lightning. Heard before seen. The third needed no crest. She knew who he was by the way the other 2 had positioned themselves slightly behind him, without seeming to realize they were doing it. Sebastian Crane, Alpha King, sovereign of 4 territories and lord of the Northern Pax. What he was doing at the choosing ceremony of a mid-ranking Alpha's son in the interior of Hartwell territory was a question no one in the hall had answered yet, and Maisie was in no condition to form questions at that moment. "Leaving already?" said the auburn-haired one, and the grin widened slightly. "The ceremony barely started. The part that concerned me is over," she said, and was quietly grateful that her voice came out steady. The leaner one with the silver ring tilted his head further, something sharp and entertained moving behind his eyes. "Fascinating," he said, more to himself than to anyone. Sebastian Crane had not spoken. He was still watching her with that same complete, unreadable stillness, and Maisie had the disorienting sensation that he was not looking at the ivory dress, or the redness she could feel at the corners of her eyes. He was looking at something underneath all of that. Something she hadn't shown anyone. Possibly something she hadn't known was visible. She took a breath and moved to step around them. His voice stopped her, low, unhurried. The kind of voice that doesn't need volume because it has never needed it. "You smell like old bloodlines," Sebastian Crane said. Maisie turned slowly to look at him. His expression hadn't shifted. He said it the way a man states a fact he has already confirmed. Not a question, not a compliment, simply an observation delivered with the calm of someone who has been waiting to say it out loud. The auburn-haired one had gone quiet. Even the one with the silver ring had stilled, watching Sebastian with the particular attention of men who know that when he speaks without being prompted, something real is being said. Behind her, the hall was still celebrating a choice that had broken something in her chest. In front of her stood the most powerful alpha on the continent, looking at her like she was the only thing in the room worth looking at. She didn't know what to do with that. She didn't know what he intended. But she knew, with a certainty that lives in the stomach rather than the mind, that the night had just changed direction entirely, and that Colin Hartwell, standing on his platform with his chosen Luna and his father's approval, had no idea what he had just thrown away. Nobody moved for a moment. The torchlight from inside the hall stretched across the threshold and caught the 3 men in uneven gold, and Maisie stood between the world she was leaving and whatever this was, holding herself very still the way animals do, when they aren't sure yet whether something is a threat or not. The night air pressed cool against her back. The sounds of the hall, voices, the clink of goblets. The low music someone had started playing as though a choosing ceremony were a reason to celebrate regardless of who got hurt, drifted out around her like smoke. Sebastian Crane had not moved either. He was watching her with the same unhurried attention, and it occurred to Maisie, in the strange suspended quality of that moment, that he was not a man accustomed to being ignored. Not because he demanded acknowledgement, but because his presence made ignoring him feel like a deliberate act requiring significant effort. She made the effort anyway. "I don't know what that means," she said, keeping her voice even. "And I'm not sure it's any of your concern." The auburn-haired one, she would learn later his name was Rowan, Beta of Clan Draveth and the Alpha King's oldest companion, let out a short sound that was almost a laugh. Not mocking. More like the involuntary response of someone watching something unexpected happen. "She's talking back to you," Rowan said, with genuine delight. "Sebastian, she's actually talking back to you. I noticed," Sebastian said. He still hadn't looked away from her. The leaner one with the silver ring stepped slightly to the side, and Maisie caught his name from the crest now visible on his inner cape lining, Crest of Morvain. That would make him Edric Morvain, advisor and blood-bound ally to the king, known in the territories as a man whose quiet observations had ended more than one political alliance before it could begin. He was watching her the way a scholar watches a text he hasn't been able to classify yet. "Old bloodlines don't lie," Edric said, still in that tone of a man talking half to himself. Particularly not ones that have been dormant long enough to be forgotten. Maisie looked at him. "I don't have a bloodline. I have no clan registration. Everyone in that hall knows it. Everyone in that hall," Edric said, with a mild precision that somehow managed to be insulting without raising his voice, "is apparently not very good at knowing things." She wanted to leave. Every reasonable part of her was pointing toward the dark path beyond the doors, toward the pine trees, and the cold air, and the dignity of removing herself from the situation, before it became something she couldn't manage. But her feet weren't moving, and she suspected it had something to do with the fact that Sebastian Crane was still looking at her as though she had said something of great importance by simply existing in his line of sight. "Oh, why are you here?" she asked him directly, because she had learned early that men who hold all the power in a room sometimes respond better to directness than to careful maneuvering. The Alpha King doesn't attend mid-territory choosing ceremonies. Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the faint adjustment of a man who has been given an answer he wasn't expecting in a form he finds more interesting than the alternative. "No," he agreed, "he doesn't." He let that sit. Maisie waited, and when nothing further came, she understood that the explanation wasn't going to be offered freely, and that pressing for it would give him something she wasn't ready to give. Proof that she cared. She turned and walked out into the night. Calla was waiting at the edge of the tree line, wrapped in a wool cloak the color of dried leaves, her dark curly hair loose around her shoulders and her expression doing the complicated work of someone who wants to ask several things at once and isn't sure which one matters most. She had been Maisie's closest companion since childhood. They had grown up 3 cottages apart at the border of Hartwell Land, both of them girls without fathers, and with mothers who worked too hard and died too young. Calla had a gift for reading faces that she claimed was purely practical, and Maisie knew was something closer to instinct. She took one look at Maisie coming through the dark and opened her arms. Maisie walked into them and stood there for a moment, not crying, just breathing, letting the smell of Calla's cloak, wool and wood smoke and the dried lavender she kept in her pockets, replace the smell of the hall. "He didn't," Calla said. Not a question. "He did." A pause. Then, "In front of everyone?" "In front of everyone." Calla's arms tightened. She didn't say anything for a while, which was one of the things Maisie valued most about her. The understanding that some moments don't need words yet, that the words can come later when the shape of the thing has settled enough to be described. "The dress is still beautiful," Calla said eventually, quietly. "Hessa worked 3 weeks on it." "I know." Another pause. "What do we do?" Maisie pulled back and looked at the hall, still lit from within, blue and silver banners visible through the open doors from where they stood. She could see movement at the threshold. The 3 men were still there, or at least 2 of them were, Rowan and Edric, talking quietly. Sebastian had moved. She couldn't see him anymore, which somehow felt more significant than if she could. "We go home," Maisie said. That's what we do. And tomorrow? Tomorrow is tomorrow. They had started walking, following the narrow path through the trees that would eventually connect to the main road back toward the border cottages, when the sound of boots on packed earth came from behind them, not running. Measured. Single set of footsteps. Maisie didn't stop walking, but she heard Calla draw a quick breath beside her. "There's a man following us," Calla murmured. "I know. A very large man. I know, Calla. Should we be—" "No." She stopped and turned, because letting someone follow you in silence is its own kind of surrender, and she had surrendered enough tonight. Sebastian Crane stood on the path 6 feet behind them, hands behind his back, as unhurried as he had been inside the hall. The moonlight suited him poorly in the way that it sometimes does with very dark-featured people. It didn't soften anything. It just made the geometry of his face clearer. He had the look of a man who had been standing in one place deciding something, and had finished deciding it. "I have a proposal," he said. Maisie waited. "My counsel has been pressing me to take Aluna for the better part of 3 years," he continued, and his voice in the open air was different than it had been inside, slightly less contained, as though the stone walls had been doing something to it. "The candidates they've presented are alliances, political arrangements, women whose bloodlines serve a function." "That's how it works," Maisie said carefully. "Generally." He looked at her with that same quality of complete attention. "You are something different. Your scent carries markers I have not encountered in a living wolf in over a decade. Ancient lines. Lines that were believed extinct." Calla had gone absolutely still beside Maisie. "You're saying I have a bloodline I don't know about." "I'm saying you have a bloodline that was deliberately hidden. There's a difference." He paused. "I'm not asking you to trust that tonight. I'm asking you to consider a proposal on other grounds first." Maisie looked at him steadily. "What proposal?" "A formal union." He said it without ceremony, without decoration, as though he were confirming an arrangement already discussed between reasonable parties. "You would come to Ashenmore as my Luna. You would have full standing, full protection, and full authority within the Northern Court. In exchange, I want to understand what you carry, what your bloodline means, and whether it means what I think it does." The forest was very quiet around them. Somewhere in the dark, a nightbird called once and went silent. "You don't know me," Maisie said. "No." "You've spoken to me for less than 10 minutes. "Yes." "And you're proposing a formal union." "I'm proposing," he said, with a patience that didn't feel condescending, only precise, "that you have been treated tonight as though you have no value. I am telling you that is incorrect. What you do with that information is your choice." Maisie held his gaze for a long moment. Behind her, she could feel Calla practically vibrating with the effort of not speaking. It was not the proposal she had imagined receiving in her life. It had none of the warmth of what she had thought she had with Colin, none of the small, ordinary tenderness of someone who had chosen her for the simple reason that she was herself. It was direct, strange, and delivered in the dark by a man she had met less than an hour ago, and yet there was something in the steadiness of him that was entirely different from every promise Colin Hartwell had ever made in the dark. Colin's promises had been warm and soft and full of feeling, and they had dissolved the moment they required cost. This man stood in the cold and offered something hard-edged and honest, and it did not feel like less. It felt somehow like more. "Give me until morning," she said. Sebastian Crane nodded once, as though that had always been the available answer, turned, and walked back toward the hall. Calla grabbed Maisie's arm the moment he was out of earshot. "Maisie," she said, in a voice that held several feelings fighting for first position. "That was the Alpha King. I know. He just proposed to you, in a forest path, 40 minutes after Colin Hartwell publicly—" "I know, Calla. What are you going to do?" Maisie looked down the dark path where Sebastian had gone, then looked up through the trees at the sky. Cold, clear, scattered with more stars than the hall had held people. She thought about 21 days of embroidery. She thought about 2 years of whispered promises. She thought about the way Sebastian Crane had said that is incorrect, as though her value were a fact he had simply corrected, with no particular emotion, because it was true, and he did not deal in things that weren't. "I'm going to think," she said. And for the first time that night, thinking felt like something that might actually lead somewhere. She didn't sleep. Calla had insisted they take a room at the small lodge near the eastern gate of Hartwell territory, rather than walk the full road home in the dark. And Maisie had agreed, because her feet hurt, and her chest hurt, and the idea of arriving at her empty cottage while still wearing the ivory dress felt like something she wouldn't survive with any dignity intact. The lodgekeeper had given them a room on the upper floor, with a low wooden ceiling, and a window that looked out over the tree line. And Calla had fallen asleep within the hour, curled on her side with her cloak pulled over her shoulders, her breathing slow and even in the way of someone whose conscience is clear. Maisie sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the window. The stars were still out. The night had the particular quality of very late hours in high-altitude places, an absolute stillness, as though the world had paused between one version of itself and the next. She had taken off the ivory dress carefully and folded it over the chair in the corner, smoothing the fabric with her palms the way Hessa would have wanted, and now she sat in her plain underdress with her hair half undone and her mother's bone clips in her hand, turning them over and over between her fingers. She tried to think clearly. Colin was done. That part was not difficult to process, or rather it was extremely difficult to process. But the shape of it was clear. 2 years. 2 years of believing someone when he said the words she most needed to hear, and the words had turned out to be the kind that cost him nothing until they cost him something. And then they simply stopped existing. She had been a secret he kept for himself. A comfort for dark nights that he was not willing to stand behind in the light. That part she understood, even if understanding it didn't make it smaller. What she didn't understand was Sebastian Crane. She turned his words over in her mind, the way she turned the bone clips in her fingers. Your scent carries markers I have not encountered in a living wolf in over a decade. She had no frame of reference for what that meant. She had never known her father. Her mother had spoken of him rarely, and always briefly, in the way of someone describing a landscape they were not planning to return to. She had no clan, no registry, no elder who had ever claimed her as part of a lineage. She was simply Maisie from the border cottages, and she had spent her entire life learning to make that enough. The idea that there was something underneath that, something old and hidden and significant enough to make the Alpha King stop in a doorway and look at her like that, it sat strangely in her chest. Not like comfort. More like the feeling of a door she hadn't known existed, slightly ajar, showing a light she couldn't identify the source of. She pressed the bone clips between her palms and made herself think about the proposal itself. It was not romantic. She was clear-eyed enough to know that. He had not looked at her across a crowded hall and felt his heart rearrange itself. He had detected something in her scent that interested him, and he had made a calculated offer on the basis of that interest, dressed in the language of respect and choice, because that apparently was how Sebastian Crane operated. Not in manipulation, but in plain terms that he expected to be evaluated plainly. There was something almost disarming about that. She had spent 2 years with a man who wrapped everything in feeling and delivered nothing real. The Alpha King had wrapped nothing in feeling and delivered an offer she could look at from all sides and assess for what it actually was, a way out of nothing, standing in a court that would have to recognize her, full authority, full protection, and underneath all of it, the implication that she was not who she had been told she was. Or rather, not only who she had been told she was. Maisie put the bone clips on the windowsill and watched the tree line until the stars began to soften at the horizon's edge. By the time the first gray light appeared, she had made her decision. She found him at dawn. He was standing near the stables at the lodge's eastern side, alone, his black mantle traded for a riding coat of dark wool, arms crossed loosely as he looked out over the mist rising from the valley below the ridge. He had the look of a man who had also not slept, or perhaps simply of a man who required very little sleep and used the remaining hours for standing in cold morning air and thinking. Rowan and Edric were nowhere visible, which she suspected was intentional. Maisie approached directly, the way she had learned to approach difficult things, without slowing down at the end, because slowing down at the end only gives fear time to find a foothold. He heard her coming and turned before she was within 10 feet, and for a moment they simply looked at each other in the gray dawn light. Up close, in daylight, he was not softer than he had been by torchlight. The angles of his face held the same quality, the same contained density, as though everything unnecessary had been stripped away a long time ago, and what remained was only what was actually there. "I have conditions," Maisie said. Something moved in his eyes. Tell me. Calla comes with me. She's not a servant. She has full standing as a free member of whatever household I'm part of. Agreed. I won't be managed. If I'm to have authority in the Northern Court, that means real authority. Not a title that gets overridden whenever it becomes inconvenient. Agreed. She paused, slightly thrown by the speed of it. She had prepared for negotiation. If at any point this arrangement causes harm to either of us, she continued, steadying herself, we discuss it honestly, and we find a solution honestly. I won't be kept in the dark about things that concern me. He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating. More like a man tasting the weight of something before confirming it. That, he said, I can also agree to, with the addition that the same applies in reverse. I won't be managed either. And I will tell you things directly, which means you should be prepared to hear things directly. That's fine. It isn't always comfortable. Neither is being lied to with warmth, she said. I know which one I prefer. The gray light was growing, the mist lifting slowly off the valley, and somewhere in the stable behind them, a horse shifted its weight and blew a quiet breath. Sebastian Crane looked at her for a long moment with that complete, assessing stillness, and then he uncrossed his arms and extended his hand, open-palmed, in the gesture that in the old tradition meant I offer this freely and without compulsion. Maisie looked at his hand, then she looked at his face. She put her hand in his. His grip was firm and brief, and when he released her, there was a warmth along her palm that lingered longer than it should have, which she filed away as something to think about later, when she had more room to think. We leave within the hour, he said. Can you be ready? I've been ready since before dawn. For the second time, that faint adjustment crossed his features. The thing that wasn't quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. He turned toward the stable, then stopped. The dress, he said, without turning back. The one you wore last night. Was it made for you? The question was unexpected enough that she answered honestly, before she could decide whether to. An old woman named Hessa made it. She spent 3 weeks on it. A pause. See that it's packed carefully, he said. It should be kept. He walked into the stable and left her standing in the morning mist, with that strange warmth still in her palm and a feeling she couldn't quite name, settling somewhere between her ribs. They rode north, before the Hartwell territory had properly woken up. Rowan had found them horses, 3 of them, a gray for Maisie, a brown for Calla, who had taken the news of their departure with a remarkably short period of shock, followed by an extremely efficient period of packing, and the company moved in a loose formation along the high road with Edric riding slightly ahead and Rowan moving alongside Maisie with the easy posture of someone who is never uncomfortable anywhere. Sebastian rode at the front. He hadn't looked back since they left. He does that, Rowan said, following her gaze. Rides ahead. He says it's practical. The rest of us have a theory that it's because he can't stand not seeing what's coming. What's the rest of your theory? Maisie asked, despite herself. Rowan's grin came easily, the kind that suggested it lived very close to the surface. That he's been doing it so long he's forgotten how to ride beside someone without feeling like he's falling behind. She considered that. That's a generous interpretation. I'm a generous person. He glanced at her sideways. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Honestly? Tears. Anger. Someone who needed convincing. The tears were for the pine trees, she said. They didn't mind. Rowan looked at her for a moment and then laughed. A real one. Unguarded. The kind that changes a face completely. I think, he said, when he'd recovered, that this is going to be very interesting. Edric, without turning, said from ahead, It already is. Maisie looked at the road unfolding north, at the mountains visible in the far distance above the tree line, at the gray sky beginning to show the first pale suggestion of actual morning color. Somewhere behind her, Calla was murmuring to her horse in the particular tone she used when she was nervous and trying not to show it. Somewhere further behind, Hartwell territory was waking up to a morning that no longer had anything to do with her. She breathed in the cold air, pine, earth, frost, and underneath it something she couldn't name, something that moved faintly when she inhaled and pulled faintly toward the figure riding at the front of the company, and decided that forward was the only direction that had ever made any sense. She didn't look back. Ashenmore announced itself before it was visible. The smell came first, Wood smoke and pine resin and something underneath both of those, something mineral and cold that Maisie couldn't name, but that pressed against the inside of her chest with a strange insistence, like a word she almost remembered. Then the road widened, the trees on either side growing older and taller, until they formed something closer to a corridor than a forest path, their trunks the width of 3 men, and their canopies high enough that the sky above appeared only in narrow strips of gray-white light. Then the gates. They were black iron and old stone, set into a wall that stretched in both directions further than she could see, and they stood open, not carelessly, but deliberately, in the way of a place that is open because it chooses to be, and could choose otherwise. The wolves stationed at the gateposts were still and watchful, and said nothing as Sebastian rode through, but their eyes moved to Maisie in a way that told her word traveled faster than horses in this territory. The castle itself sat at the end of a long approach, built into the face of the mountain rather than merely against it, so that the upper levels seemed to emerge directly from the rock. It was not beautiful in the way that things built for beauty are beautiful. It was beautiful the way weather is beautiful, because it was entirely itself without apology, made for purpose rather than impression. Dark stone, narrow windows that glowed amber from within. Towers that didn't reach for height so much as simply occupy it, as though they had always been there, and the mountain had grown up around them. Calla pulled her horse alongside Maisie's and said nothing for a moment, just looked. "Well," she said finally, quietly, "it's real." "Did you think it wasn't?" "I think part of me thought we'd wake up in the lodge and none of this would have happened." Maisie understood that. She had thought something similar approximately every 20 minutes since dawn. The Northern Court received her with the particular quality of attention that powerful places give to unexpected things, complete and unreadable, every face present and giving away nothing. She was shown to her chambers by a woman named Dara, the castle's head of household, who was compact and gray-haired, and moved with the efficiency of someone who had been managing complicated situations for a very long time and found them no longer complicated. The chambers were larger than any room Maisie had ever occupied. Stone walls hung with tapestries in deep green and charcoal. A fireplace already burning. A window seat overlooking the mountain's western face where the late afternoon light lay flat and silver over the valley below. The bed was canopied in dark wool. There was a writing desk, a wardrobe, a separate antechamber that Dara indicated would be Calla's. "The Alpha King will receive you in the Great Hall at sundown," Dara said, pausing at the door. "There will be members of the Inner Council present. They will want to assess you, I assumed." Dara looked at her for a moment, with the expression of someone recalibrating a prior estimate. "Good," she said, and left. Calla appeared from the antechamber with wide eyes and a look of controlled overwhelm. "My room has 2 windows," she said, "and a chair that I think is older than the Hartwell clan. Don't sit in it until you know it holds." "I already sat in it. It holds remarkably well." She came further into the room and lowered her voice, which was unnecessary given that they were alone, but felt right. "Maisie, what are we doing here?" It was the honest question underneath all the others. Maisie sat on the edge of the window seat and looked at the valley. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I think we're finding out." The great hall at sundown was lit by iron chandeliers hung with dozens of candles, and the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat and something faintly herbal moved through the warm air. The Inner Council of the Northern Court occupied one long side of the central table. 7 wolves, 5 men, and 2 women, all of them carrying the specific quality of people who have held power long enough that it no longer shows as posture or expression, but simply as the way they take up space. Sebastian sat at the head. He had changed from the riding coat into a dark tunic with the silver insignia of the Crane bloodline at the collar, and he looked, in the candlelight of his own hall, like something that had been made specifically for that chair in that room in that particular quality of light. He was watching the door when Maisie entered, which she noticed, and which she suspected he had intended her to notice. She wore the second dress she owned, plain gray wool, no embroidery, nothing that could be read as an attempt at impression. She had left her hair down because pinning it felt like armor she didn't want to pretend to need. The council looked at her. She looked back at each of them in turn, taking her time, letting the assessment run both directions. "Maisie of the Border Territories," Sebastian said, and his voice in this hall was exactly as it had been in the stone hall of Hartwell, entirely at home in the acoustics of old rooms. "I've brought her here as my intended Luna. The formal bonding ceremony will take place within the fortnight." He paused, and the pause was deliberate. "I'll hear any questions now." There was a brief silence, the kind that has a texture. The eldest council member, a heavy-set man with a white-streaked beard named Councillor Harith, whose reputation for bluntness was apparently well-earned, set down his goblet. "She carries no clan," he said, not unkindly but without softening it either. "She carries a bloodline," Sebastian replied. "That is not the same thing as having a clan. It is in several ways more significant. The council would need evidence of that bloodline before—" "The council," Sebastian said, with a quietness that was not the quietness of deference, "will have it. I've already sent word to the archive at Greyvale. The records of the dormant lines are being retrieved." He looked at Harith steadily. "In the meantime, she is here under my recognition. That is sufficient." Harith held his gaze for a moment, then nodded, slowly, in the way of a man who disagrees but recognizes a closed door when he sees one. One of the two women on the council, younger, sharp-featured, with the crest of Clan Morvain on her sleeve, which made her likely a relation of Edric's, leaned forward slightly. "What does she bring?" the woman asked, and she was looking at Maisie when she asked it, not at Sebastian, not the bloodline. Her. "What does she bring?" The question landed in the room and sat there. Maisie understood that it was being asked of her, not about her, and that the distinction mattered. She answered it herself. "I don't know yet what my bloodline means," she said, and her voice didn't waver. "But I know how to read a room and tell the truth in it. I know how to make decisions when the comfortable options are gone. I know how to stand in a place where I'm not wanted and not mistake that for a place I don't belong." She held the woman's gaze. Whether that's useful to this court is something we'll find out together. The hall was quiet. Rowan, seated to Sebastian's right, looked at his goblet with the expression of a man suppressing something. Edric, to the left, made a small mark on the parchment in front of him, with the air of someone noting a data point they had predicted, but are pleased to confirm. Sebastian had not moved, but something in the set of his jaw had shifted, very slightly, in a direction that Maisie was beginning to learn to read. The woman with the Morvain crest sat back in her chair. "Fair enough," she said. The fortnight that followed had the quality of two people learning the edges of each other, without yet touching the center. Sebastian was not warm in the way Maisie had once thought she needed warmth to be. He did not find small reasons to seek her out, did not leave flowers or send messages, or create the small, unnecessary contacts that men use when they want to show interest without committing to it, but he was present in a way that she came to recognize as its own language. He appeared at the end of her first full day to ask if the chambers were adequate. He sent Dara with a map of the castle's lesser-known corridors after Maisie got turned around twice in the first 3 days. When she mentioned at a council briefing that she couldn't follow a particular land dispute because no one had given her the relevant history, a full written summary appeared on her writing desk the following morning in his hand. Direct. Without decoration. Entirely useful. She asked him one evening when they happened to be the last two remaining in the council chamber after a meeting that had run long, whether he ever did anything without a reason. He considered the question genuinely, which she appreciated. "Not often," he said. "Does that bother you?" "No," she said, honestly. "I spent 2 years with someone who did everything with feeling and nothing with follow-through. Reason is something I can work with." He was quiet for a moment. In the way she was learning meant he was weighing something. "The man from the ceremony," he said. "He made you promises he intended to keep." "He made promises he intended to mean at the time," she said. "That's different." Sebastian looked at her across the table. "Yes," he said. "It is." The candles had burned low around them, and the smell of wood smoke and old stone filled the chamber, and Maisie was aware, with a clarity that felt new, that she was not afraid of this man. She was not comfortable in the easy, familiar way of people who have known each other long. She was something else, something that required a different word. She was steady near him, as though a frequency she had been slightly off from her whole life had been very quietly adjusted. She didn't say that. It was too large and too new, and she had learned to be careful with large new things. But she noticed it. The records from the Greyvale archive arrived on the 12th day. Edric brought them to Sebastian's study himself, which told her the content was significant before anyone said a word. She was already there. Sebastian had asked her to be present, which itself told her something. And she watched Edric set the leather-wrapped bundle on the table with a care that was not about the physical weight of the thing. Sebastian untied the binding and opened the topmost document. He read it in silence. His face gave nothing away, as it rarely did, but his stillness had a different quality this time. More complete. The stillness of a man who has just confirmed something he suspected, but hadn't been entirely certain of until this moment. He looked up at her. "Your mother's name," he said. Was it Senna? The floor felt briefly different under her feet. Yes. And she came from the western reaches, before the border territories. She started, then stopped. She never talked about where she came from. Not really. Sebastian turned the document toward her. She stepped forward and looked at it. Old parchment, ink faded at the edges but clear at the center. Names in a column that she followed down with her finger until she found one she recognized, and then followed sideways across the page to what it connected to. The line was long. It went back further than she had breath to follow in that moment. At the top of the lineage, circled in a later hand than the original record, were 2 words she knew from every old story told around every fire in every pack territory she had ever heard of. The founding bloodline. Maisie stood very still and looked at those words for a long time. "This is real," she said. It wasn't a question. She was looking at the document, not at him. "It's real," Sebastian said. She put her finger on the page, on the name Senna, on the line that connected her mother to something that had apparently been hidden so long that everyone had stopped looking for it. She thought about her mother working the border fields until her hands cracked in winter. She thought about a woman who never explained where she came from because she was keeping something safe in the only way available to her, by making it invisible. She thought about a dress taking 3 weeks to make, and a man who couldn't stand behind what he'd promised. "He chose Petra Voss," she said quietly, still looking at the page. "He let me walk out of that hall and he chose Petra Voss." She wasn't angry. She was something more complete than angry. Sebastian said nothing, because he was a man who understood when nothing was the right thing to say. After a moment, Maisie looked up. "When is the ceremony?" she said. 3 days, Sebastian said. She nodded. Good. The bonding ceremony of the Northern Court was nothing like a Hartwell choosing. There were no long tables of strangers eating and drinking while someone stood on a platform and made a decision that would define another person's life. There were no banners competing for dominance along the walls, no politics dressed as celebration, no undercurrent of alliances being calculated behind polite faces. The great hall of Ashenmore had been cleared to its bones, stone floor, iron chandeliers, the mountain at the windows, and the wolves who filled it were the ones who belonged there, the inner council, the senior pack members, Rowan and Edric standing to one side with the posture of men who are genuinely pleased about something and making only modest efforts to conceal it. Dara near the back, arms folded, expression doing the careful work of someone who doesn't show feeling easily, but is currently losing that battle by a narrow margin. Calla stood in the first row with her hands clasped in front of her and her eyes very bright, wearing the green wool dress she had borrowed from the castle stores and had already decided she was keeping. Maisie stood at the center of the hall in the ivory dress. She had taken it out of the brown paper folding that morning and held it for a moment before putting it on, feeling the weight of the fabric and running her thumb along the bramble embroidery at the hem, still there, still precise. Small silver loops of wild growth along the bottom edge. Hessa had made it for a night that turned out to be something other than what either of them had imagined. Maisie had decided that the right answer to that was not to retire the dress, but to give it a better night to belong to. She had left her hair down. The bone clips were at her wrist, tied there with a thin cord, close to her pulse. Sebastian was already standing at the center of the hall when she entered, and he watched her cross the full length of the room with that complete, unhurried attention that she had initially found disorienting, and had come to understand as one of the most honest things about him. He did not look away. He did not perform composure. He simply watched her come toward him, the way a man watches something he has been waiting for, without being entirely sure it would arrive. She stopped in front of him, up close, in the candlelight of his own hall, with no political emergency between them, and no negotiation being conducted. He looked like himself in a way she hadn't had the stillness to observe before. There were lines at the corners of his eyes from years of the particular expression he made when he was assessing something. His hands, at his sides, were steady. He smelled of wood smoke and cold air and something underneath both of those that her instincts had been quietly cataloging for a fortnight without her permission. "You wore it," he said. "Hessa spent 3 weeks on it," she said. It deserved a ceremony worth the work. Something shifted in his face. That thing that wasn't quite a smile arrived and stayed longer than it usually did, long enough this time to reach his eyes, and Maisie felt it in her chest, with a directness that she no longer tried to argue with. The elder who conducted the rite was old enough that his voice had the texture of gravel and old wood, and the words he spoke were the old words, the ones that predate any specific clan or territory, and belong to wolves the way breathing belongs to wolves. Not chosen, simply true. He spoke of recognition, of the thing that moves between two people when something fundamental in one responds to something fundamental in the other, of the choice to stand beside that recognition and call it home. Sebastian held out his hand, open-palmed, the same gesture he had made in the gray dawn outside the lodge, the offer freely given, the compulsion absent. Maisie put her hand in his. The warmth that moved through her when their palms met was nothing like the brief functional warmth of their first handshake. It was deeper and slower, and moved through her, the way heat moves through cold stone. Gradually, from the point of contact outward, until she felt it in her shoulders, her throat, the small of her back. She heard Sebastian draw a slow breath, and from the quality of it she understood that he felt it too, and that he had perhaps expected it, but not quite in that measure. The elder completed the words. The hall was very quiet. Sebastian looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the assessment, not the contained authority, not the faint, not quite smile. Something underneath all of those. Something that had been waiting behind the composure for long enough that showing it now required a particular kind of courage, the kind that is harder for people who are not accustomed to needing it. "I didn't bring you here only for the bloodline," he said quietly enough that it was only for her. "I want you to know that. I knew it before the records arrived." "I know," she said. "You know? You told me to pack the dress carefully," she said. "Men who want bloodlines don't think about dresses." The not-quite smile became, briefly and completely, an actual one. It changed his face in a way that she suspected very few people had seen. And she felt the particular warmth of being trusted with something rare. Rowan, from across the hall, began to clap with the uninhibited enthusiasm of a man who has been waiting a long time for something to go right. Edric joined him with considerably more restraint, but no less genuine feeling. The rest of the hall followed, and the sound filled the old stone room and went up into the mountain. Calla was crying, which she would later deny. The weeks after the bonding settled into something Maisie had not had a word for before, and was slowly constructing one for now. Not ease, exactly. The Northern Court was complex, and the politics of 4 territories required constant attention. And there were council members who remained skeptical, and situations that required her to stand her ground and hold it without flinching. Not simplicity. Nothing about Sebastian Crane was simple, and learning the full shape of him was the work of seasons. Not weeks, but something that lived near the word right. The particular quality of a life that is being lived in the correct direction. She took her place at council with the confidence of someone who has learned that authority is not given by title alone, but by the willingness to exercise it when it counts. Herath, the eldest counselor who had questioned her at the first meeting, became in time one of the people she respected most. Blunt, consistent, and genuinely persuadable by good argument, which she found more valuable than agreement. The Morvain woman, whose name was Sarah, became something approaching an ally, in the careful way of two people who respect each other's edges. Edric had begun leaving books on her writing desk. Ancient texts, histories of the old bloodlines, records of the founding lines, and what had been documented of their particular traits. She read them at the window seat in the evenings, the valley going dark below and the fire at her back, and gradually the shape of what she carried became clearer to her. Not as something external and attached, but as something that had always been part of her structure, as much as bone. The old bloodline carried, the records suggested, an instinct for truth, not the ability to compel it in others, but an innate resistance to being deceived, and a corresponding difficulty in deceiving. It explained, among other things, why she had always known something was wrong with Colin's warmth, before she had known what specifically was wrong with it. Why she had trusted Sebastian's plainness in the gray dawn in a way she couldn't entirely justify rationally. The instinct had been working longer than the reasoning had. She told Sebastian this one evening. He was quiet for a moment. "That explains several things about the first night," he said. "Such as, you weren't afraid of me. Most people are afraid of me. I noticed you noticing that," she said. It was notable. Was that why you followed us onto the path? Because I wasn't afraid? He considered. Partly, he said. Partly because you walked out of that hall without making anyone else responsible for what you were feeling. A pause. I've been in rooms full of powerful people my entire life. I've rarely seen that. Maisie looked at the fire for a moment. I had a dress to protect, she said. Falling apart would have ruined the embroidery. Sebastian looked at her, and she looked back, and the smile came again. Easier this time, more resident, as though it had found a place it was willing to stay. Colin Hartwell came north in the early spring. He came officially, under the banner of a trade negotiation that Clan Hartwell had requested with the Northern Territories. And Maisie knew he was coming 3 days before he arrived, because Edric monitored all formal correspondence with the quiet thoroughness of a man who believes information is the only currency that doesn't devalue. She said nothing about it to Sebastian, not because she was hiding it, but because she was curious what she would feel when she saw Colin and wanted to find that out without anyone else's attention on her face when she did. She found out in the outer courtyard on a gray spring morning. He arrived with a small delegation, and he looked the same. Handsome in the way that alpha sons are, dark hair, broad shoulders, wearing the blue of Clan Hartwell. He was scanning the courtyard with an expression she recognized from 2 years of reading his face. The particular arrangement of his features, when he was calculating how something was going to go. His eyes found her and stopped. She was standing near the courtyard steps in a charcoal riding coat, her hair pinned back, one of Edric's books under her arm that she'd been reading while she waited. She watched Colin's face go through several things in rapid sequence. Recognition. Then something she might once have mistaken for longing. Then a realization arriving in stages, like light coming under a door. He looked at the castle behind her, at the crane insignia on the gate, at the way the wolves in the courtyard positioned themselves relative to where she was standing. He looked at her. She waited. Maisie, he said. His voice had a quality in it she didn't think he intended to be audible. Colin, she said, evenly, fully. He opened his mouth and closed it again. There was nothing to say that didn't cost more than he looked ready to pay, and she suspected he knew that. She had spent 2 years learning his calculations. She could still read them. She felt, standing in the spring courtyard of Ashenmoor, exactly what she had expected to feel, and had confirmed only by being there to feel it. Nothing that unmade her, a closed thing, a door that had been shut from the inside by someone who had finished with the room. Not happiness at his discomfort, not triumph. Just the quiet, complete knowledge that she was standing in the right place, wearing the right life, and that no part of what Colin Hartwell had chosen for himself had any purchase on her anymore. I hope the alliance with Clan Voss is everything you needed, she said, and meant it without irony. She went inside. Calla stayed. She had found, within the first month at Ashenmoor, that the castle's eastern library needed organizing, and that she was apparently the person most suited to do it, a project which grew gradually into a formal role managing the court's historical records. She was, by the end of the year, indispensable in the way that people with genuine gifts for a specific work become indispensable, not through maneuvering, simply through being very good. She had also developed a friendship with Rowan that neither of them described as anything other than friendship with a frequency that suggested otherwise, but Maisie left that alone. Rowan remained exactly himself, which was generous and irreverent, and occasionally catastrophic in social situations, in ways that were always somehow endearing rather than damaging. He was the first person to make Sebastian laugh in Maisie's presence. A real laugh, startled out of him in the middle of a council meeting by something Rowan said that was not appropriate for council meetings. And she was grateful to him for that, because it showed her a version of Sebastian she had suspected existed and was glad to confirm. Edric continued leaving books on her desk, graduated eventually to discussing them with her directly, and became in time one of the most honest conversations she had access to. Unsparing, occasionally unsettling, always worth having. Herath died in the autumn of the following year, peacefully, surrounded by his family in the way he had always lived, bluntly and well. Maisie attended his memorial, and said something true about him that made his daughter grip her hand afterward and not let go for a long moment. Old Hessa, when Maisie finally sent for her, came north in a wagon and arrived at Ashenmoor with 3 trunks of fabric, a complete absence of impressed reaction to the castle, and a look at Sebastian that lasted exactly long enough to determine something to her satisfaction before she turned to Maisie and said, "You did all right," girl with the conviction of someone closing an argument they'd been making privately for years. She lived in a set of rooms in the castle's south wing with good light and refused every offer of assistance with the stairs. The first winter Maisie spent as Luna of the Northern Court. The mountain above Ashen Moor received more snow than it had in a decade, and the castle settled into itself the way old stone does in cold. Deeper, quieter, more itself. In the evenings, the great hall smelled of wood smoke and pine and roasting meat, and the specific warm human smell of a place that is genuinely occupied, and the sounds that moved through it were the sounds of a court that had found its shape. Maisie sat in the window seat of their chamber late one such evening, the valley invisible below a cover of cloud, the fire at her back, Sebastian's voice somewhere behind her reading aloud from one of the archive documents in the low, unhurried way he read aloud when he thought something was worth saying at full length. She was not entirely listening. She was looking at the snow on the glass and feeling the warmth at her back and the weight of the bone clips at her wrist and the quiet, solid, unhurried reality of the life that had been built, piece by careful piece, from the ruins of one night in a hall that hadn't deserved her. She thought about the bramble embroidery along the hem of an ivory dress. Small, precise, almost invisible unless the light caught it at the right angle. She thought about old Hessa's fingers, patient over 21 days, making something beautiful for a girl the world had decided had no particular claim to beautiful things. She thought about a gray dawn and an open palm, and a voice that said that is incorrect as simply as stating a direction on a road. Sebastian stopped reading. She heard him set the document down. "You've gone quiet," he said. "I'm thinking." "About?" She turned from the window to look at him. Firelight, dark eyes, the face that had become the most familiar landscape in her life, the one she navigated not with caution anymore, but with the ease of someone who knows the terrain. "About how wrong a night can go," she said, "and still end up being the right one." Sebastian held her gaze for a moment with that complete attention that had never once faltered from the first night in the torchlit doorway. "Yes," he said, simply, as though it were a thing he had known for a while and was glad to finally have confirmed aloud. The snow pressed against the window, the fire held. The mountain kept its stillness around them, old and absolute, the way mountains do when the thing they've been waiting to shelter has finally arrived and settled in for good.